The world of hidden rituals and occult practices has fascinated humanity for centuries, yet behind the sensational headlines and horror movie portrayals lies a complex reality that few dare to examine. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on 33 documented ritualistic practices that have emerged from the shadows of history, law enforcement files, and first-hand accounts. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about organized occult activity. Before we begin, understand this. The line between documented fact and sensationalized fiction has been deliberately blurred for decades. The panic that swept through America in the 1980s created a fog of misinformation that still clouds our understanding today. But through careful research of law enforcement records, historical documents, and expert analysis, we can separate the genuine ritualistic practices from the manufactured hysteria. The first thing you need to understand is that modern Satanism isn't what most people imagine. When Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in 1966, he created something entirely different from the devil-worshipping cults of popular imagination. LaVeyan Satanism is fundamentally atheistic, viewing Satan not as a literal being, but as a symbol of human nature and rebellion against arbitrary authority. Their rituals are psychological theater, designed for cathartic release rather than supernatural invocation. The Church of Satan's greater magic rituals follow specific patterns. Practitioners dress in black robes, light candles, and perform ceremonies in specially prepared chambers. The ritual space is purified with salt and blessed with inverted pentagrams. Participants engage in dramatic recitations from the Satanic Bible, focusing their emotional energy toward specific goals. These aren't supernatural summonings, but sophisticated psychological exercises designed to channel anger, lust, or desire into focused intent. Contrast this with the Temple of Set, founded by Michael Aquino in 1975 after his departure from LaVey's church. Where LaVeyan Satanism remains atheistic, the Temple of Set embraces theistic beliefs, viewing Set as an actual deity. Their rituals involve complex ceremonial magic, drawing heavily from Egyptian symbolism and Hermetic traditions. Practitioners perform elaborate invocations, use ritual implements like chalices and daggers, and engage in pathworking exercises designed to commune with what they believe are genuine spiritual entities. The Setian ritual chamber is a carefully constructed sacred space. Black candles illuminate altars adorned with Egyptian symbolism. Practitioners wear ceremonial robes bearing the symbol of Set, a distinctive angular design. The rituals themselves involve lengthy invocations in ancient Egyptian, complex visualizations, and what adherents describe as direct communication with Set himself. Unlike LaVeyan ceremonies, these rituals claim to produce genuine supernatural effects. But these organized groups represent only the surface of ritualistic practice. Law enforcement agencies have documented a far more disturbing category: self-styled Satanists who use occult symbolism to justify criminal behavior. These individuals aren't following any established tradition, but rather creating their own twisted interpretations of satanic practice. The case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, exemplifies this phenomenon. Ramirez claimed satanic beliefs and adorned himself with pentagrams, but his practices bore no resemblance to any legitimate occult tradition. He would break into homes, assault victims, and leave behind crude satanic symbols drawn in blood or lipstick. These weren't ritual murders in any traditional sense, but rather the actions of a disturbed individual appropriating occult imagery for psychological effect. More organized but equally disturbing were the Chicago Rippers, led by Robin Gecht in the early 1980s. This group combined sexual violence with crude ritualistic elements, including readings from the Satanic Bible during their attacks. Law enforcement analysis revealed that their practices were primarily motivated by sadistic pleasure rather than genuine religious belief, with occult elements serving as a thin veneer over criminal activity. The historical grimoire tradition represents a completely different category of ritualistic practice. These medieval and Renaissance-era texts provided detailed instructions for what practitioners believed was genuine magical work. The Key of Solomon, perhaps the most famous grimoire, contains elaborate procedures for summoning and commanding spiritual entities. A typical Solomonic ritual requires extensive preparation. The practitioner must fast for days, purify themselves through ritual baths, and create complex magical circles inscribed with Hebrew names of power. The ritual space is consecrated with incense and holy water, while the magician dons specially prepared robes and wields consecrated implements, including a magic sword, wand, and pentacle. The actual summoning involves hours of complex invocations, during which the practitioner attempts to compel spiritual entities to appear within a specially prepared triangle outside the protective circle. Historical accounts describe apparitions manifesting as everything from beautiful angels to terrifying demons, though modern analysis suggests these visions were likely products of intense psychological states induced by the ritual process itself. The Picatrix, an Arabic grimoire from the medieval period, focuses on astrological magic and the creation of talismans. Its rituals are timed to planetary movements and involve the creation of complex magical objects designed to channel celestial influences. Practitioners would spend weeks preparing materials, including metals mined at specific lunar phases and herbs gathered during particular astrological configurations. Necromantic practices, despite their sinister reputation, were often performed by medieval clergy seeking to commune with deceased saints or gain divine knowledge. These rituals typically involved elaborate preparations, including fasting, prayer, and the creation of protective circles. The necromancer would summon spirits of the dead through complex invocations, often in cemetery settings during specific lunar phases. Historical necromantic rituals required extensive material preparations. Practitioners would obtain grave dirt from specific types of burial sites, create incense from rare herbs, and fashion ritual implements from materials associated with death. The ceremonies themselves involved lengthy invocations in Latin or Hebrew, with the necromancer protected within carefully constructed magical circles while attempting to compel the dead to provide information or services. The modern chaos magic movement has stripped away much of the ceremonial complexity while maintaining focus on practical results. Chaos magicians create personalized rituals combining elements from various traditions, often incorporating modern technology and pop culture references. Their practices might involve meditation on corporate logos, ritual use of video games, or invocations directed at fictional characters treated as genuine spiritual entities. Contemporary Wiccan and neo-pagan groups have developed their own ritualistic traditions, often emphasizing healing and personal development rather than the commanding of spiritual forces. These practices typically involve the creation of sacred circles, invocation of elemental powers, and seasonal celebrations aligned with natural cycles. While less dramatic than grimoire traditions, these rituals follow specific patterns and are taken seriously by practitioners as genuine spiritual work. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, though founded in the late 19th century, established ritual patterns that continue to influence modern occult practice. Golden Dawn ceremonies involve elaborate grade initiations, each revealing additional symbolic knowledge and ritual techniques. Practitioners advance through a complex hierarchy, learning increasingly sophisticated magical practices, including astral projection, divination, and the creation of magical implements. Golden Dawn ritual chambers are precisely arranged according to Kabbalistic principles, with altars positioned to represent the Tree of Life structure. Initiates wear colored robes indicating their grade level and carry ritual implements including wands, cups, swords, and pentacles, representing the four elements. The ceremonies themselves involve complex symbolic dramas designed to trigger specific psychological and spiritual states. The distinction between legitimate religious practice and criminal activity becomes crucial when examining cases like the Fall River cult murders. Led by Carl Drew in the late 1970s, this group combined prostitution and drug dealing with crude satanic rituals. Drew convinced followers that he was the son of Satan and conducted ceremonies in wooded areas, involving animal sacrifice and sexual violence. Law enforcement analysis revealed that Drew's rituals bore little resemblance to any established occult tradition. Instead, they served as tools of psychological control, using fear and religious symbolism to maintain dominance over vulnerable individuals. The murders attributed to the group were motivated by practical concerns about police informants rather than any genuine religious imperative. International cases have revealed similar patterns of criminal activity, disguised as religious practice. The Superior Universal Alignment cult in Brazil, led by Valentina de Andrade, combined New Age beliefs with ritual child abuse. De Andrade convinced followers that certain children were spiritually dangerous and needed to be ritually sacrificed to prevent cosmic catastrophe. The investigation revealed that De Andrade's rituals were entirely fabricated, combining elements from various spiritual traditions into a coherent-seeming but ultimately fraudulent system. The murders were motivated by De Andrade's psychological need for control rather than any genuine spiritual belief, with occult elements serving to justify and ritualize criminal behavior. Professional law enforcement analysis distinguishes between three categories of ritual-related criminal activity. True believers possess genuine knowledge of occult traditions and conduct rituals with meticulous attention to symbolic detail. Dabblers attempt to emulate established practices but lack sufficient knowledge to perform them accurately. True criminals use occult symbolism purely as a tool for psychological manipulation or post hoc justification for criminal acts. The challenge for investigators lies in determining which category applies to any specific case. True believers, while their practices may seem bizarre, are typically engaging in protected religious activity. Dabblers may be influenced by media portrayals or incomplete knowledge, but aren't necessarily engaged in criminal behavior. True criminals, however, represent a genuine threat and often use occult elements to increase their psychological impact on victims. Understanding these distinctions requires familiarity with authentic occult traditions and their historical development. The modern Western occult revival began in the late 19th century with groups like the Golden Dawn and continued through figures like Aleister Crowley and his Thelemic system. These traditions, while controversial, represent legitimate religious and philosophical movements rather than criminal conspiracies. Crowley's Thelemic rituals, based on his reception of the Book of the Law in 1904, involve complex ceremonial procedures designed to align practitioners with their true will. The famous Gnostic Mass combines elements of Christian liturgy with ancient pagan symbolism, creating a ceremony that serves as both religious worship and magical working. Practitioners wear specific colored robes, consume ritual cakes and wine, and perform elaborate symbolic actions designed to invoke spiritual transformation. The contemporary Satanic Temple, founded in 2012, represents yet another approach to satanic practice. Unlike LaVeyan Satanism's focus on self-empowerment or Setian theology, the Satanic Temple uses Satan as a symbol of rebellion against religious tyranny and social injustice. Their rituals often take the form of public demonstrations designed to challenge Christian privilege in American society. Satanic Temple ceremonies might involve the unveiling of Baphomet statues at government buildings, ritualized protests against restrictions on reproductive rights, or mock exorcisms designed to highlight the absurdity of religious exemptions to secular law. These aren't traditional occult rituals, but rather performance art with political intent, using satanic symbolism to make points about religious freedom and separation of church and state. The academic study of ritual violence remains in its infancy, partly due to the controversial nature of the subject matter and the difficulty of obtaining reliable data. Researchers must navigate between sensationalized media accounts, law enforcement reports that may be influenced by moral panic, and the testimonies of individuals who may have experienced genuine trauma or false memories implanted through questionable therapeutic techniques. What emerges from careful analysis is a picture far more complex than either the conspiracy theories of the Satanic Panic era or the complete dismissal of ritual-related crime favored by some academics. While large-scale conspiracies of devil-worshipping child abusers have never been substantiated, isolated cases of individuals and small groups using occult symbolism in connection with criminal activity do exist. The key insight for understanding contemporary occult practice is recognizing the diversity of motivations and beliefs within what appears to be a single phenomenon. Some practitioners are engaging in legitimate religious activity protected by the First Amendment. Others are exploring alternative spirituality or engaging in psychological self-development. A small minority are using occult symbolism to justify or enhance criminal behavior. This complexity makes simple categorizations impossible and requires careful analysis of specific cases rather than broad generalizations about occult practice as a whole. The challenge for both law enforcement and the general public is developing sufficient knowledge to distinguish between protected religious activity, harmless but unconventional spiritual practice, and genuine criminal behavior disguised as religious expression. The historical development of these practices reveals patterns that continue to influence contemporary occultism. Medieval grimoires established the basic framework of ceremonial magic that continues in modern groups. The 19th century occult revival created new synthetic traditions, combining elements from various historical sources. The 20th century saw both the development of new religious movements and the appropriation of occult symbolism by individuals with no genuine spiritual motivation. Understanding this historical context is crucial for evaluating contemporary claims about satanic ritual abuse or organized occult criminal activity. Many of the practices described in sensationalized accounts can be traced to specific historical traditions, but their contemporary use may bear little resemblance to their original context or intent. The psychological appeal of ritualistic practice, whether criminal or benign, lies in its ability to create intense emotional states and provide a sense of meaning and purpose. For legitimate practitioners, rituals serve as tools for spiritual development, community building, or personal transformation. For criminals, the same techniques may be used to create fear, establish dominance, or justify otherwise inexplicable behavior. The investigation of ritual-related crime requires specialized knowledge that few law enforcement agencies possess. Looking back at everything that's happened, it becomes clear that what people call satanic rituals exist on a spectrum far more complex than most realize. We've seen how legitimate religious groups operate alongside criminal enterprises that merely borrow occult symbolism for their own twisted purposes. But there's another layer to this darkness that demands our attention. The rituals we haven't discussed yet are perhaps the most disturbing because they blur the line between organized religion and criminal conspiracy. These are the ceremonies that take place in basements of suburban homes, in abandoned warehouses, on the outskirts of forgotten towns, and yes, even in places you'd never suspect. Consider the practice known as the Black Mass. Unlike the theatrical rituals of LaVeyan Satanism, authentic Black Mass ceremonies are designed as deliberate inversions of Christian worship. Historical accounts describe these rituals dating back to medieval Europe, where renegade priests would perform perverted versions of the Catholic Mass. The altar would be a naked woman's body. The communion bread would be replaced with substances I won't describe here. And the entire ceremony would culminate in acts that violated every conceivable moral boundary. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. Law enforcement documents from the 1980s describe discovering evidence of modern Black Mass ceremonies in several locations across the American Midwest. Unlike the fantasy versions depicted in horror movies, these real rituals followed specific protocols outlined in grimoires like the Grand Grimoire and the Red Dragon. The practitioners weren't Hollywood stereotypes in black robes. They were teachers, businessmen, even clergy members who had formed clandestine groups. The ritual components discovered at these sites painted a disturbing picture. Inverted crosses carved from human bone, chalices that tested positive for human blood, and ceremonial daggers with microscopic traces of tissue that forensic analysis couldn't definitively identify. The investigation files note that participants would fast for 3 days before each ceremony, believing this heightened their spiritual receptivity to demonic influence. Then there are the initiation rituals that separate casual practitioners from true believers. The Order of Nine Angles, a genuinely dangerous occult group that emerged from Britain in the 1960s, requires new members to commit actual crimes as part of their advancement. Their foundational text, the Naos, explicitly encourages human sacrifice as the ultimate expression of their philosophy. This isn't role-play or psychological theater. Members have been convicted of murder in several countries, with investigators finding copies of Oné literature at crime scenes. The initiation process begins with what they call insight roles, where candidates must spend months or years infiltrating and disrupting other organizations. Some join religious groups to corrupt them from within. Others enter law enforcement or social services to gather intelligence on potential victims. The most committed become what the organization calls opfers, individuals who dedicate their entire lives to advancing the group's agenda of social collapse. But perhaps most disturbing are the rituals involving children that have been documented by international law enforcement. The 2019 investigation into the Hampstead case in London revealed detailed accounts of ritualistic abuse occurring in tunnels beneath a primary school. While some aspects of the case remain disputed, physical evidence included children's drawings depicting specific ritual scenarios that matched historical descriptions found in medieval demonology texts. The children described being forced to participate in ceremonies where they would drink blood from silver cups, watch the sacrifice of infants, and endure sexual abuse while adults chanted in languages they couldn't understand. Linguistic analysis of the recorded chanting matched invocations found in the Pseudo-Monarchia Demonum, a 16th-century grimoire that provides specific instructions for summoning demonic entities. What makes these accounts particularly credible is their consistency with ritual abuse cases documented in other countries. Belgian investigators working on the Dutroux affair uncovered similar patterns of abuse involving occult symbolism. Victims described being taken to underground chambers decorated with pentagrams and inverted religious imagery, where they witnessed ceremonies that combined sexual violence with elements drawn from medieval satanic texts. The psychological manipulation involved in these rituals serves multiple purposes. First, it creates trauma bonds between victims and perpetrators, making it less likely that children will report the abuse. Second, the occult elements provide a framework for the abusers to justify their actions as serving a higher spiritual purpose. And third, the bizarre nature of the abuse makes it less likely that authorities will believe victim testimonies. Moving beyond criminal enterprises, we encounter rituals practiced by individuals who genuinely believe they're communicating with demonic entities. These solitary practitioners, often called theistic Satanists, perform ceremonies designed to invoke actual supernatural beings. Unlike the psychological symbolism of LaVeyan Satanism, these rituals are conducted with the sincere belief that demons exist as literal entities. The ritual processes typically begin with extensive preparation periods involving fasting, meditation, and the creation of ritual implements. Practitioners spend months crafting their own ritual daggers, chalices, and altar pieces, believing that the personal investment of time and energy imbues these objects with spiritual power. The final implements are often works of disturbing artistry, incorporating materials like human hair, bone fragments, and metals that have been charged through prolonged exposure to negative emotions. The invocation ceremonies themselves follow patterns established in classical grimoires, but adapted for modern practitioners. The ritual space is prepared with specific geometric patterns drawn in materials ranging from salt to human blood. Candles made from human fat provide illumination, their flames believed to serve as beacons for demonic entities. The air is thick with incense, blended from plants associated with death and decay. Hemlock, belladonna, and dried fungi harvested from cemetery soil. As the ritual progresses, practitioners report entering altered states of consciousness where they claim to receive direct communication from demonic beings. These entities allegedly provide knowledge about hidden aspects of reality, instructions for manipulating other people, and guidance for advancing the practitioner's personal power. The conversations are typically recorded in ritual journals written in coded languages or symbolic scripts that make them incomprehensible to outsiders. But the most concerning aspect of these solitary practices is how they can escalate over time. What begins as intellectual curiosity about forbidden knowledge gradually transforms into genuine belief in the practitioner's special relationship with supernatural forces. This progression often coincides with increasing social isolation, paranoid thinking, and a growing sense that normal moral constraints don't apply to someone who has been chosen by demonic entities. Case studies from forensic psychologists reveal a disturbing pattern among individuals who commit violent crimes after years of solitary ritual practice. They describe feeling compelled to act as agents of their demonic contacts, carrying out instructions received during ritual sessions. The crimes often incorporate symbolic elements drawn from their ritual practice, creating crime scenes that appear to have occult significance. The ritual murder of Stephen Newberry in Carl Junction, Missouri, provides a stark example of how solitary practice can lead to violence. The perpetrators had spent months performing rituals designed to summon demonic guidance about their life problems. When they felt their requests weren't being answered, they decided that a human sacrifice might demonstrate their commitment and earn them greater supernatural assistance. The murder itself incorporated elements from multiple grimoire traditions. The victim was killed with a baseball bat during a ritual that began at midnight on the night of a new moon. His blood was collected in a ceremonial chalice and consumed by the perpetrators, who believed this would transfer his life force to their demonic patrons. The body was then mutilated according to instructions they claimed to have received during previous ritual sessions. What makes cases like this particularly disturbing is the methodical way the perpetrators planned and executed their crimes. These weren't crimes of passion or sudden psychotic breaks. They were the logical culmination of ritual practices that gradually eroded the participants' connection to normal human empathy and moral reasoning. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It begins with small transgressions that violate social norms but don't cause serious harm. A practitioner might steal ritual supplies from a religious store, telling themselves that their spiritual needs justify the theft. They might lie to family members about their activities, creating a double life that separates their ritual practice from their public persona. As the practice deepens, the transgressions become more serious. Animal sacrifice enters the picture, often justified as a traditional element of historical magical practice. The practitioner tells themselves they're simply following ancient traditions, no different from kosher or halal slaughter. But the psychological impact of killing sentient beings as part of ritual work creates a profound shift in how they relate to suffering and death. The final step in this progression involves viewing other human beings as potential ritual components rather than fellow people deserving of moral consideration. This shift is often accompanied by elaborate rationalizations drawn from the practitioner's study of occult philosophy. They might convince themselves that their chosen victim is spiritually inferior, or that the murder will serve some greater cosmic purpose that justifies the harm inflicted. Throughout this process, the ritual practice provides a framework for the practitioner to interpret their psychological changes as spiritual advancement rather than moral deterioration. Each transgression becomes evidence of their growing power and freedom from conventional limitations. The isolation required for secret ritual practice prevents them from receiving feedback that might challenge their distorted thinking. But individual practitioners represent only one aspect of the ritual landscape we're examining. Far more organized and potentially dangerous are the networks of practitioners who coordinate their activities across multiple locations. These groups operate with sophisticated communication systems, shared resources, and hierarchical structures that can persist for decades. The network discovered by Italian authorities in 2004 provides insight into how these organizations function. Operating across 7 European countries, the group maintained a membership of over 300 individuals who participated in coordinated ritual activities. Members included professionals from every level of society: doctors, lawyers, teachers, government officials, and business executives. The network's rituals followed a calendar based on astronomical events and dates significant in various occult traditions. Members would gather at predetermined locations for ceremonies that lasted several days and involved dozens of participants. The logistics alone required extensive planning and coordination, with safe houses established in remote locations and transportation networks to move members without detection. But the most disturbing aspect of this network was its recruitment strategy. Rather than seeking out individuals already interested in occult practices, the group targeted people in positions of influence who could be compromised through their participation in illegal activities. Once someone attended a ritual involving criminal acts, they became subject to blackmail that ensured their continued cooperation. The recruitment process typically began with seemingly innocent invitations to exclusive social gatherings. Potential members would be introduced gradually to increasingly transgressive activities, with each step carefully calibrated to maintain their involvement while deepening their complicity. By the time participants realized the true nature of what they'd joined, they were too compromised to withdraw without facing serious personal and professional consequences. This network model has been identified in multiple countries, suggesting that organized ritual groups have developed sophisticated methods for maintaining secrecy while expanding their influence. The challenge for law enforcement is that these organizations often operate within legal boundaries until they don't, making it difficult to intervene before serious crimes occur. The rituals themselves serve multiple functions within these networks. Obviously, they provide the spiritual or psychological satisfaction that draws people to occult practices in the first place. But they also create strong social bonds between participants who share dangerous secrets, establish hierarchies based on willingness to transgress normal boundaries, and provide opportunities for the group's leadership to identify and exploit the weaknesses of individual members. As we examine these various forms of ritual practice, a disturbing pattern emerges. Whether we're looking at historical grimoire traditions, modern criminal enterprises, solitary practitioners, or organized networks, the same psychological and social dynamics appear repeatedly. The rituals provide a framework for gradually eroding normal moral constraints while creating intense bonds between participants and offering explanations for antisocial behavior that make it seem justified or even noble. Understanding these patterns is crucial for anyone trying to distinguish between harmless spiritual exploration and genuinely dangerous occult activity. Moving deeper into the shadows of organized ritual practice, we encounter networks that operate with chilling sophistication. Their ceremonies designed not merely for spiritual purposes, but as instruments of power, control, and psychological manipulation. These groups understand that true influence comes not from crude displays of violence, but from the methodical exploitation of human psychology through carefully orchestrated ritualistic experiences. The European clandestine networks represent perhaps the most disturbing evolution of organized ritual practice. Unlike the theatrical ceremonies of Leviathan Satanism, or even the genuine spiritual pursuits of theistic groups, these organizations deploy ritual as a weapon of social engineering. Their gatherings are elaborate productions designed to create psychological dependency among participants while simultaneously gathering compromising material for future leverage. These networks typically operate through invitation-only events held in remote locations, often repurposed historical buildings with their own dark associations. The ceremonies themselves blend elements from various occult traditions, but the authentic spiritual components are secondary to the primary objective of creating a sense of shared transgression among attendees. Participants are gradually introduced to increasingly compromising activities, each step documented and catalogued for potential future use. The psychological manipulation employed by these groups is remarkably sophisticated. They understand that human beings crave belonging and meaning, particularly those who feel disconnected from conventional society. The ritualistic framework provides both structure and justification for behaviors that participants might otherwise find morally objectionable. The group creates an alternative moral universe where traditional ethical boundaries are systematically eroded through communal participation in transgressive acts. What makes these networks particularly dangerous is their integration with legitimate social and political structures. Members often hold positions of influence in business, government, and cultural institutions. The ritual gatherings serve dual purposes, functioning as both bonding experiences and insurance policies. When someone has participated in activities that would destroy their reputation or career if exposed, they become permanently compromised and controllable. The recruitment process for these networks is methodical and patient. Potential members are identified through various means, often beginning with seemingly innocent social connections or professional relationships. The initial approach rarely involves any mention of occult practices. Instead, prospects are invited to exclusive social gatherings, intellectual salons, or cultural events where they can be observed and evaluated. The assessment process examines several key factors. Recruiters look for individuals with exploitable vulnerabilities, whether financial pressures, career ambitions, personal secrets, or psychological needs. They particularly target those who feel alienated from mainstream society or who harbor resentments against established institutions. The most valuable prospects are those who combine personal vulnerability with professional or social influence. Once a prospect has been identified as suitable, the cultivation process begins. This involves a gradual introduction to the group's philosophy and practices, carefully calibrated to the individual's psychological profile. The process might begin with philosophical discussions about the nature of power, morality, and social control. Gradually, more explicit material is introduced, always framed within intellectual or spiritual contexts. The actual initiation ceremonies are designed to create maximum psychological impact. New members are typically required to participate in acts that violate their previous moral boundaries, creating cognitive dissonance that the group then helps resolve through its alternative value system. These acts are always witnessed by other members and often recorded, ensuring that the new initiate becomes immediately compromised and invested in the group's survival. The regular ceremonial gatherings serve multiple functions within these networks. On the surface level, they maintain group cohesion and reinforce the alternative moral framework that justifies the organization's activities. The ritualistic elements create a sense of shared purpose and belonging, while the transgressive nature of the activities creates strong psychological bonds between participants. More cynically, these gatherings serve as ongoing insurance policies. Each ceremony creates new compromising material that can be used to ensure member loyalty and silence. The group maintains detailed records of participation, creating a comprehensive database of leverage over its membership. This documentation is often stored in multiple secure locations, with access controlled by the group's leadership structure. The influence operations conducted by these networks are typically subtle and long-term. Rather than seeking immediate dramatic results, they focus on gradually shifting cultural and political landscapes in directions that serve their interests. Members in media positions might subtly influence public discourse, while those in academic institutions might shape research agendas or educational curricula. The financial aspects of these networks are equally sophisticated. The organizations often control significant resources through a combination of member contributions, business ventures, and more questionable revenue streams. These funds are used to maintain operational security, reward loyalty, and expand influence. The financial structures are typically complex and international, making them difficult to trace or disrupt. The security measures employed by these groups reflect their understanding of modern surveillance capabilities and law enforcement techniques. Communications are conducted through encrypted channels, with multiple layers of operational security protecting sensitive information. Physical meetings are carefully planned and executed, with extensive counter-surveillance measures and legal protections in place. The psychological toll on individual members varies significantly. Some participants appear to fully embrace the group's ideology and find genuine satisfaction in their involvement. Others seem to exist in a state of psychological compartmentalization, maintaining their public personas while participating in activities that contradict their stated values. A third category consists of members who have become trapped by their compromised status and continue participating primarily out of fear. The impact on family members and close associates of network participants is often severe, even when they remain unaware of the individual's involvement. The psychological stress of maintaining such a significant secret, combined with the moral conflicts inherent in participation, frequently manifests in deteriorating personal relationships, substance abuse, and other behavioral changes. The recruitment of younger members presents particular ethical concerns. While these groups typically avoid involving minors directly in their activities, they often target young adults who are still developing their moral frameworks and decision-making capabilities. The long-term psychological impact on individuals who become involved during their formative years can be profound and lasting. The relationship between these networks and legitimate occult or spiritual communities is complex and often contentious. Many genuine practitioners of various esoteric traditions actively distance themselves from these groups, recognizing that their activities corrupt and exploit spiritual practices for mundane power objectives. However, the networks often deliberately blur these distinctions, using authentic spiritual terminology and symbolism to provide cover for their operations. Law enforcement agencies face significant challenges in investigating these networks. The sophisticated operational security, the high-profile nature of many participants, and the often ambiguous legal status of ritual activities create substantial obstacles to effective investigation. Additionally, the networks often have members or allies within law enforcement and legal systems, providing early warning of investigations and influencing their outcomes. The international nature of many of these networks adds another layer of complexity to law enforcement efforts. Organizations often span multiple jurisdictions, with activities carefully distributed to take advantage of different legal systems and international cooperation limitations. Evidence gathering becomes exponentially more difficult when activities cross national boundaries. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by these groups have been refined over decades of practice. They understand how to exploit fundamental human needs for belonging, meaning, and power. The ritualistic framework provides a powerful tool for reshaping individual psychology, creating new loyalties that supersede previous moral commitments and social bonds. The gradual nature of involvement in these networks makes it difficult for participants to recognize the full extent of their compromise until it is too late to withdraw safely. Each step seems relatively minor in isolation, but the cumulative effect is profound psychological and practical entrapment. By the time individuals fully understand the nature of their situation, they have typically already participated in activities that would destroy their lives if exposed. These networks represent perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous evolution of ritual practice in the modern era. They combine genuine understanding of human psychology with ruthless pragmatism, creating organizations that wield significant influence while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. As we delve deeper into the shadowy world of ritual practices, we must confront a disturbing reality that law enforcement agencies have documented across multiple jurisdictions. The line between organized occult groups and criminal enterprises has become increasingly blurred, with some networks operating sophisticated recruitment systems that target vulnerable individuals through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. These groups often begin their recruitment process through seemingly innocuous channels. College campuses, online forums dedicated to esoteric studies, and even certain bookshops specializing in occult literature have become hunting grounds for predatory organizations seeking new members. The initial approach is typically subtle, involving discussions about spiritual enlightenment, ancient wisdom, or the promise of accessing hidden knowledge that mainstream society deliberately conceals. The recruitment methodology employed by these networks demonstrates a chilling understanding of human psychology. Potential recruits are first subjected to what experts term love bombing, where they receive overwhelming attention, validation, and a sense of belonging they may have never experienced before. This initial phase creates powerful emotional bonds that become increasingly difficult to break as the individual becomes more deeply involved with the group. Once basic trust is established, the real indoctrination begins. New members are gradually introduced to increasingly extreme ideologies and practices through a carefully calibrated process that researchers have identified as systematic desensitization. What begins with meditation sessions and philosophical discussions slowly evolves into participation in rituals that become progressively more disturbing and morally compromising. The hierarchical structure within these organizations mirrors that of sophisticated criminal enterprises. At the lowest levels are the newly recruited members who serve primarily as sources of labor, financial contributions, and potential victims for higher-level rituals. These individuals often remain unaware of the true nature of the organization's activities, believing themselves to be part of a spiritual community focused on personal growth and enlightenment. Middle-tier members, often referred to as disciples or initiates, have typically been with the organization for several years and have demonstrated their loyalty through participation in increasingly serious criminal activities. These individuals serve as enforcers, recruiters, and administrators who help maintain the organization's day-to-day operations while shielding the leadership from direct involvement in illegal activities. At the apex of these networks are the true believers and masterminds who orchestrate the group's activities with calculated precision. These individuals often possess extensive knowledge of occult traditions, psychology, and criminal methodology. They understand how to exploit legal loopholes, manipulate their followers, and maintain operational security while directing their organizations toward increasingly dangerous objectives. The financial aspects of these criminal occult networks reveal their true predatory nature. Members are systematically drained of their resources through mandatory donations, expensive ritual materials, and fees for advancing through the organization's hierarchical structure. Properties are often signed over to the group under the guise of spiritual commitment, leaving members financially dependent and unable to easily escape, even when they begin to question the organization's practices. Communication within these networks operates through sophisticated encrypted channels and coded language that helps them evade law enforcement detection. Members use specific terminology, symbols, and meeting protocols that appear innocuous to outsiders but carry deeper meaning within the organization. This communication system allows for coordination of activities across multiple geographic regions while maintaining plausible deniability for leadership figures. The most disturbing aspect of these networks involves what law enforcement has classified as ritual abuse cases. These incidents often involve vulnerable members being subjected to psychological torture, sexual exploitation, and physical violence under the guise of spiritual purification or advancement. The ritualistic nature of this abuse serves multiple purposes. It creates powerful psychological trauma that increases member compliance, provides blackmail material to prevent defection, and satisfies the sadistic impulses of the organization's leadership. Children within these organizations face particularly horrific treatment. Born into families already involved with these groups or recruited through family connections, these young victims are systematically conditioned to accept abuse as normal religious practice. They are often isolated from mainstream society, denied proper education, and subjected to ritual trauma designed to create dissociative disorders that make them more compliant and less likely to seek help from authorities. The integration of modern technology has dramatically expanded the reach and effectiveness of these criminal occult networks. Social media platforms provide unprecedented access to potential recruits, while cryptocurrency enables financial transactions that are difficult for authorities to trace. Dark web marketplaces facilitate the exchange of illegal materials, including ritualistic implements, banned substances, and even access to victims for those willing to pay the required prices. Perhaps most concerning is the evidence of infiltration into legitimate institutions. Law enforcement investigations have revealed connections between these occult networks and individuals working in schools, social services, healthcare facilities, and even government agencies. This infiltration provides these organizations with access to vulnerable populations, advance warning of investigations, and the ability to manipulate official records to protect their activities. The psychological profile of individuals who rise to leadership positions within these organizations reveals common characteristics that should concern anyone studying this phenomenon. These individuals typically display narcissistic personality traits, a grandiose sense of self-importance, and a complete lack of empathy for their victims. They view other human beings as disposable resources to be exploited for their own gratification and advancement within the organization's power structure. The international scope of these networks presents significant challenges for law enforcement agencies operating within traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Evidence suggests that some of these organizations operate across multiple countries, with leadership figures maintaining residences in nations with weak extradition treaties or corrupt legal systems that can be easily manipulated through bribery or intimidation. As we examine the evolution of these criminal occult networks, it becomes clear that they represent a sophisticated form of organized crime that exploits humanity's deepest spiritual longings for predatory purposes. The combination of religious manipulation, psychological coercion, and criminal enterprise creates an environment where the most heinous acts can be justified as spiritual necessity while generating substantial profits for those orchestrating these operations. The challenge facing law enforcement and mental health professionals is developing effective strategies for identifying, infiltrating, and dismantling these networks while providing appropriate support for victims who have been psychologically damaged by their experiences. The secretive nature of these organizations, combined with the psychological control they exercise over their members, makes traditional investigative approaches often ineffective and requires specialized training and resources that many agencies currently lack. Understanding the true nature of these criminal occult networks is essential for protecting vulnerable individuals from recruitment and exploitation. We've traced the dark evolution of ritual practices from their historical roots to modern manifestations. But the most disturbing truth lies in what happens when legitimate occult traditions become corrupted by criminal intent. The research reveals something far more sinister than simple religious practice or even isolated criminal acts. It exposes systematic networks that have learned to weaponize the very foundations of human spiritual yearning. The transformation begins subtly. Groups that start with authentic ceremonial magic traditions gradually introduce elements that serve dual purposes. A ritual circle becomes a method of psychological control. Sacred texts become tools for manipulation. The gradual corruption is so seamless that participants often don't realize when they've crossed from legitimate spiritual practice into something far darker. What makes these networks particularly dangerous is their sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They don't recruit through obvious means. Instead, they identify individuals who are spiritually seeking, intellectually curious, or emotionally vulnerable. The recruitment process mirrors what experts call grooming, a slow introduction to increasingly extreme concepts and practices, each one normalized before the next is introduced. The financial structures supporting these networks reveal their true scope. Unlike simple criminal organizations focused on immediate profit, these groups operate with long-term strategic thinking. They establish legitimate businesses, charitable foundations, and even educational institutions that serve as fronts for their activities. Money flows through complex international channels, making detection and prosecution extremely difficult. The ritual abuse documented in these networks serves multiple functions beyond simple sadism. It creates psychological bonds between perpetrators, ensuring silence through shared culpability. It traumatizes victims in ways that make their testimony unreliable or unbelievable. And it provides the group with material for blackmail and control that can last decades. Perhaps most chilling is how these networks adapt and evolve. They study law enforcement techniques and adjust their methods accordingly. They monitor social media and online forums to identify potential threats or opportunities. They even infiltrate legitimate occult communities, law enforcement agencies, and child protection services to stay ahead of investigations. The technology component cannot be overlooked. Modern criminal networks use encrypted communication platforms that make surveillance nearly impossible. They employ sophisticated financial technologies to move money without detection. Some groups have even developed their own secure networking systems, creating what amounts to a dark internet within the internet. The international scope of these operations defies traditional law enforcement boundaries. A child might be abused in one country, the images transmitted to another, and the financial proceeds laundered through a third. Investigators pursuing one thread often find it leads to networks spanning multiple continents with connections they never expected. What emerges from this research is a picture of organized evil that surpasses most people's capacity to comprehend. These aren't random acts of violence or simple criminal enterprises. They represent a systematic corruption of human spiritual and social institutions, designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of society while remaining largely invisible to the general public. The psychological profiles of those involved reveal disturbing patterns. Many participants appear to lead normal lives in their communities. They hold respectable jobs, maintain families, and participate in civic activities. This dual existence allows them to operate with minimal suspicion while providing them with access to potential victims and resources. The ritualistic elements serve practical criminal purposes beyond their symbolic significance. Timing ceremonies around specific dates creates predictable patterns that aid in coordination across different geographic locations. The use of specific symbols and phrases serves as a form of coded communication. Even the locations chosen for rituals are selected for strategic reasons: isolation for security, symbolic significance for psychological impact, and practical considerations for body disposal or evidence destruction. The most sophisticated networks have learned to exploit legitimate institutions and systems. They place members in positions within social services, education, law enforcement, and religious organizations. This infiltration serves multiple purposes: early identification of vulnerable targets, advance warning of investigations, and the ability to discredit or silence those who might expose their activities. The evidence suggests these networks have existed in various forms for decades, possibly centuries, adapting their methods to each era's technology and social structures. What we're witnessing today may simply be the latest evolution of something far older and more entrenched than most people realize. The challenge for society lies not just in stopping individual crimes, but in recognizing and dismantling systems of organized corruption that have become deeply embedded in our institutions. The very complexity that makes these networks effective also makes them incredibly difficult to combat through traditional law enforcement methods. Understanding these patterns isn't about feeding paranoia or conspiracy theories. It's about recognizing that human evil can be far more organized, systematic, and sophisticated than we want to believe. We stand at the threshold of something far more sinister, far more pervasive than the scattered criminal acts we've examined. The dark networks we've uncovered represent merely the surface of a vast underground ecosystem that has evolved beyond simple ritual practices into something resembling a shadow economy of human exploitation and spiritual manipulation. The sophistication of these modern occult networks defies everything law enforcement previously understood about organized crime. Unlike traditional criminal organizations that operate within recognizable hierarchies, these groups function as decentralized cells connected through encrypted communication systems, shared ideologies, and ritualistic practices that serve both spiritual and practical purposes. They've learned to exploit the very skepticism that protects them, understanding that their activities will be dismissed as folklore or conspiracy theories. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources reveals networks that span continents, operating through seemingly legitimate businesses, spiritual organizations, and even charitable foundations. These groups have mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, conducting their most heinous activities behind facades of respectability. They recruit from vulnerable populations, targeting individuals experiencing spiritual crises, financial desperation, or psychological trauma. The recruitment process itself represents a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Potential members are initially drawn in through seemingly benign spiritual practices, meditation groups, or alternative healing communities. Over months or years, they're gradually introduced to more extreme ideologies and practices. The process is so subtle that many participants don't realize they've crossed lines until they're already deeply embedded within the network. These organizations have developed sophisticated methods for maintaining absolute secrecy. Members undergo extensive psychological conditioning designed to ensure loyalty and silence. They employ compartmentalization techniques where individual members know only their specific role and a limited number of contacts. This structure makes it nearly impossible for law enforcement to dismantle entire networks even when they successfully infiltrate or arrest individual members. The financial resources at their disposal are staggering. These networks have established complex money laundering operations that funnel resources through multiple countries and jurisdictions. They've infiltrated legitimate businesses, using them as fronts for their activities while generating substantial profits that fund their expansion. Some estimates suggest these networks generate billions of dollars annually through various illegal enterprises. The technological sophistication of these groups rivals that of state-sponsored criminal organizations. They utilize advanced encryption, secure communication platforms, and sophisticated surveillance countermeasures. Many have developed their own secure networks, creating digital sanctuaries where they can operate with impunity. They've also learned to exploit vulnerabilities in existing systems, infiltrating government databases, law enforcement networks, and financial institutions. What makes these networks particularly dangerous is their ability to adapt and evolve. They study law enforcement techniques, legal precedents, and investigative methods, constantly refining their operations to stay ahead of authorities. When one cell is compromised, the network quickly adjusts, sealing off the breach and relocating critical operations to new locations and personnel. The psychological profiles of individuals involved in these networks reveal disturbing patterns. Many high-ranking members exhibit characteristics consistent with organized psychopathy, displaying superficial charm, manipulative behavior, and complete lack of empathy. They've learned to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities in their targets. Using sophisticated techniques borrowed from cult psychology, corporate manipulation, and military psychological operations. The ritualistic aspects of these networks serve multiple purposes beyond their stated spiritual or ideological goals. The ceremonies create powerful psychological bonds between members, establishing shared experiences that make betrayal psychologically difficult. The rituals also serve as initiation processes, gradually escalating in intensity to ensure complete commitment from participants. Each ceremony represents another step deeper into the network, making escape increasingly difficult. The exploitation of children within these networks represents perhaps their most horrific aspect. Children are targeted not only for abuse, but for long-term conditioning and recruitment. These networks have developed systematic approaches to breaking down psychological barriers in young victims, creating individuals who may never fully recover from their experiences. The generational nature of this abuse ensures a steady supply of new members who know no other way of life. The infiltration of legitimate institutions by these networks poses a threat that extends far beyond their immediate criminal activities. They've placed members in positions within law enforcement, judicial systems, social services, and educational institutions. This infiltration allows them to protect their operations, gather intelligence on investigations, and identify potential victims among vulnerable populations. The international scope of these networks makes effective law enforcement response extremely challenging. They operate across jurisdictions, exploiting differences in legal systems, investigative capabilities, and international cooperation agreements. Evidence that might be admissible in one country may be inadmissible in another, creating opportunities for criminals to escape justice by simply crossing borders. The psychological warfare techniques employed by these networks extend beyond their immediate membership to influence broader society. They deliberately spread disinformation, fund seemingly legitimate research that supports their ideologies, and work to undermine trust in institutions that might oppose them. They've learned to exploit social media and digital communication platforms to spread their influence while maintaining plausible deniability. The training programs within these networks rival those of military special operations units. Members undergo intensive conditioning designed to create unwavering loyalty, suppress empathy, and develop skills necessary for their roles within the organization. This training often includes techniques for psychological manipulation, surveillance, counter-surveillance, and violence when necessary. The economic impact of these networks extends far beyond their direct criminal activities. They distort markets through their money laundering operations, corrupt legitimate businesses through their infiltration efforts, and impose enormous costs on society through the resources required to investigate and prosecute their activities. The human cost, measured in destroyed lives and traumatized victims, is incalculable. The emergence of these sophisticated occult networks represents a fundamental evolution in organized crime. They've successfully merged ancient ritualistic practices with modern technology, psychological manipulation techniques, and international criminal methodologies. They represent a new form of organized crime that law enforcement agencies are still learning to understand and combat. The battle against these networks requires unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, technology experts, and international organizations. Traditional investigative techniques prove insufficient against organizations that have spent decades perfecting their operational security and psychological manipulation techniques. New approaches, new technologies, and new forms of international cooperation will be necessary to effectively combat this threat. The story of these networks serves as a chilling reminder that evil can adapt, evolve, and organize with frightening efficiency. They represent the dark side of human ingenuity, demonstrating how the same technologies and techniques that improve our lives can be perverted to serve the most heinous purposes. Understanding their methods, their psychology, and their organizational structures represents the first step in developing effective countermeasures against these threats to human dignity and safety. As we've seen throughout this examination, the line between legitimate spiritual practice and criminal exploitation can be deliberately blurred by those who seek to profit from human suffering. The labyrinth of organized occult practices extends far beyond what most people imagine, reaching into territories where legitimate spiritual exploration collides with criminal enterprises that exploit ancient symbols for modern control. What you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about the intersection of faith, power, and manipulation in our contemporary world. The distinction between authentic religious practice and predatory exploitation becomes crucial when examining cases like the Manson family, where Charles Manson manipulated occult imagery and apocalyptic theology to maintain psychological control over his followers. Manson's tactics revealed how charismatic leaders weaponize spiritual concepts, creating elaborate belief systems that justify violence while insulating the leadership from direct culpability. His followers believed they were participating in a cosmic war, demonstrating how occult symbolism can be twisted to rationalize the most heinous acts. Similarly, the Order of the Solar Temple, active in the 1980s and 1990s, represented a sophisticated blend of New Age spirituality, Templar mythology, and apocalyptic beliefs that ultimately led to mass murder-suicides across multiple countries. Led by Joseph D. Mambro and Luc Jouret, this organization attracted wealthy professionals and intellectuals who were gradually indoctrinated into believing that death was a transition to a higher spiritual plane. The group's rituals incorporated elements from various esoteric traditions, creating an elaborate theatrical experience that reinforced their apocalyptic worldview. The psychological manipulation employed by these groups follows predictable patterns that law enforcement agencies now recognize. Initial recruitment often targets individuals experiencing personal crises, offering them a sense of belonging and higher purpose. The gradual introduction of increasingly extreme beliefs, combined with social isolation from outside influences, creates a controlled environment where rational thinking becomes nearly impossible. Financial exploitation typically accompanies spiritual manipulation, with members surrendering their assets to fund the organization's activities. Modern technology has transformed how these groups operate and recruit. Online platforms provide unprecedented access to vulnerable individuals, allowing manipulative leaders to cast wider nets while maintaining anonymity. Social media algorithms can inadvertently funnel people toward increasingly extreme content, creating pathways that lead from casual interest in spirituality to dangerous cult involvement. Encrypted communications and cryptocurrency transactions make it easier for these organizations to operate across international boundaries while evading law enforcement. The infiltration of legitimate institutions represents perhaps the most concerning aspect of contemporary occult-related criminal activity. Educational institutions, religious organizations, and even government agencies have been targeted for infiltration by groups seeking to expand their influence and protect their operations. This systematic approach to gaining institutional power demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that goes far beyond the stereotypical image of disorganized cult activity. Financial crimes often accompany the spiritual manipulation, with sophisticated schemes designed to extract maximum value from members while providing legal protection for leadership. Money laundering through religious organizations, tax evasion schemes disguised as charitable donations, and complex investment frauds targeting the spiritually minded represent just a few examples of how these groups monetize their control over followers. The international dimension of these networks cannot be overlooked. Groups like Aum Shinrikyo in Japan demonstrated how apocalyptic cults can develop capabilities that threaten national security, including chemical weapons production and plans for mass casualty attacks. The organization's combination of Eastern mysticism, scientific expertise, and violent intentions created a hybrid threat that challenged traditional law enforcement approaches. Recruitment strategies have evolved to exploit contemporary anxieties about social isolation, economic uncertainty, and political instability. Groups now tailor their messaging to appeal specifically to demographics experiencing particular stresses, whether that's financial pressure, relationship problems, or existential confusion. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology displayed by these organizations rivals that of professional marketers and political operatives. The role of technology in modern ritual practices adds another layer of complexity to these organizations. Some groups have incorporated digital elements into their ceremonies, using apps, virtual reality, and online platforms to create immersive experiences that reinforce their belief systems. This technological integration can make it easier to maintain control over geographically dispersed members while creating new forms of psychological manipulation. Law enforcement agencies have developed specialized units to investigate these complex organizations, recognizing that traditional investigative approaches often prove inadequate when dealing with groups that operate across multiple jurisdictions and exploit religious freedom protections. International cooperation has become essential as these networks increasingly operate on a global scale, sharing resources and coordinating activities across continents. The legal challenges posed by these groups reflect the delicate balance between protecting religious freedom and preventing criminal exploitation. Courts must distinguish between legitimate spiritual practices and predatory behavior, often requiring judges and juries to navigate complex theological questions while evaluating evidence of psychological manipulation and financial fraud. Understanding the sophisticated nature of these modern occult-related criminal enterprises reveals a threat landscape that demands serious attention from law enforcement, policymakers, and the general public. The combination of ancient symbols with cutting-edge technology, charismatic leadership with systematic exploitation, and spiritual promises with criminal intent creates challenges that will only grow more complex as technology continues to evolve and social institutions face increasing pressure. The landscape of ritualistic practices grows more complex when we examine how modern technology has transformed these ancient systems. What began as localized groups operating in isolation has evolved into sophisticated networks that leverage encrypted communications, cryptocurrency transactions, and digital recruitment strategies to expand their influence across continents. These contemporary organizations represent a fusion of old and new, where traditional ceremonial elements serve as the foundation for elaborate psychological manipulation schemes. Members are initiated through carefully orchestrated experiences that combine genuine spiritual practices with systematic conditioning. The result is a hybrid system where authentic religious conviction becomes indistinguishable from manufactured dependency. The recruitment process itself has become a science. Target identification now relies on data mining techniques that can identify vulnerable individuals through their online behavior patterns. Social media algorithms inadvertently assist these groups by creating echo chambers that amplify feelings of isolation and spiritual seeking. Once identified, potential recruits are approached through seemingly innocent channels, meditation groups, philosophical discussion forums, or alternative healing communities. The sophistication of modern ritual abuse networks extends far beyond their historical predecessors. These organizations employ psychological professionals who understand trauma bonding, dissociation, and memory manipulation. They utilize these techniques not merely for control, but to create perfect witnesses, individuals whose testimony becomes unreliable even to themselves. This systematic approach to psychological destruction serves multiple purposes. It silences victims, creates devoted followers, and generates plausible deniability for the organization. Financial structures within these groups have evolved to match their operational complexity. Money laundering occurs through legitimate businesses, charitable organizations, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Members are often required to contribute not just their labor and loyalty, but substantial financial resources. These contributions are justified through elaborate theological frameworks that present financial sacrifice as spiritual purification. The international scope of these networks presents unique challenges for law enforcement. Jurisdictional boundaries become meaningless when operations span multiple countries, each with different legal frameworks and investigative capabilities. Evidence collected in one nation may be inadmissible in another, while extradition treaties often fail to account for the complex nature of ritual-based crimes. Technology has also transformed the nature of the rituals themselves. Live streaming capabilities allow geographically dispersed members to participate in ceremonies simultaneously, creating a sense of unified experience despite physical separation. Digital documentation serves both as insurance against betrayal and as material for further manipulation of participants. The permanence of digital records creates additional leverage over members who might consider leaving. The integration of legitimate spiritual practices with criminal activities creates particular challenges for identification and prosecution. Many activities that appear concerning to outsiders fall within the bounds of religious freedom protections. The line between unconventional worship and criminal conspiracy becomes blurred when examining groups that may spend months or years engaging in seemingly harmless activities before introducing more problematic elements. Child exploitation within these networks has become increasingly sophisticated and difficult to detect. Rather than the dramatic scenarios portrayed in popular media, modern abuse often occurs through gradual normalization processes that make identification by outside observers nearly impossible. Children born into these systems may never experience normal social interactions, making their eventual testimony unreliable or incomprehensible to conventional legal proceedings. The psychological profiles of contemporary ritual abuse perpetrators reveal individuals who often genuinely believe in their spiritual mission while simultaneously engaging in calculated criminal behavior. This compartmentalization allows them to maintain normal social facades while participating in activities that would be unconscionable to most people. Many display high levels of intelligence and professional success, making them particularly effective at avoiding detection. Medical professionals have documented specific trauma patterns associated with ritualistic abuse that differ from other forms of victimization. These patterns include complex dissociative disorders, specific phobia clusters, and unusual somatic symptoms that can persist for decades after the abuse ends. However, the specialized nature of these presentations means that many healthcare providers lack the training to recognize or treat them effectively. The role of technology in perpetuating these systems extends beyond communication and organization. Sophisticated audio and visual manipulation techniques can create false memories or reinforce existing trauma through carefully crafted sensory experiences. Virtual reality technology, while still emerging in this context, presents possibilities for psychological manipulation that were previously impossible. Geographic analysis of reported ritual abuse cases reveals patterns that suggest coordinated networks rather than isolated incidents. Certain regions show clustering of reports that correlate with other factors such as transient populations, proximity to transportation hubs, or areas with weak law enforcement presence. These patterns suggest strategic positioning rather than random occurrence. The intergenerational nature of many ritual abuse networks creates unique dynamics where victims become perpetrators while maintaining their victim status within the organization's hierarchy. This blurring of roles makes traditional victim-perpetrator models inadequate for understanding these systems. Individuals may simultaneously experience genuine trauma while inflicting it on others, creating complex psychological states that resist conventional therapeutic approaches. Modern ritual abuse networks have also learned to exploit legal protections designed to safeguard legitimate religious practices. They establish formal religious organizations, acquire tax-exempt status, and invoke religious freedom defenses when challenged by authorities. This legal camouflage provides significant protection while allowing continued criminal activity under the guise of spiritual practice. The evolution of these systems represents one of the most disturbing adaptations of ancient practices to modern circumstances. Where historical ritual abuse was limited by geography, communication, and resources, contemporary networks operate with global reach, unlimited financial resources, and technological capabilities that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. As we approach the final segments of our investigation, we must confront perhaps the most disturbing evolution in modern occult practices: the emergence of technologically sophisticated networks that blur the line between traditional ritual activity and organized criminal enterprise. These aren't the isolated incidents of troubled individuals we've previously examined, but rather coordinated operations that represent a fundamental shift in how occult organizations operate in the digital age. The transformation began in the early 2000s, when traditional occult groups discovered the power of encrypted communications and anonymous networks. What started as simple message boards for discussing esoteric philosophy quickly evolved into something far more sinister. These platforms became recruitment grounds for individuals seeking power, control, and the fulfillment of darker impulses that conventional society would never tolerate. Unlike the historical groups we've studied, these modern networks operate with a level of sophistication that would make intelligence agencies envious. They utilize advanced encryption protocols, cryptocurrency transactions, and distributed communication systems that make traditional law enforcement methods largely ineffective. Members communicate through layers of anonymity, using code words and symbolic language that draws heavily from classical grimoire traditions while incorporating contemporary elements. The recruitment process has become particularly insidious. These organizations target vulnerable individuals through seemingly innocent online communities focused on alternative spirituality, personal empowerment, or historical occultism. Potential recruits are gradually exposed to increasingly extreme ideologies through a carefully orchestrated process that psychological experts recognize as systematic indoctrination. What makes these groups especially dangerous is their ability to blend legitimate spiritual practices with criminal activities. They often begin by teaching authentic meditation techniques, historical research methods, or artistic expression rooted in occult symbolism. This creates a foundation of trust and perceived authenticity that makes members more susceptible to later manipulation. The hierarchical structure of these organizations mirrors traditional occult orders, but with modern corporate efficiency. Lower-level members might engage in relatively benign activities like creating artwork, maintaining websites, or participating in philosophical discussions. They often remain unaware of the criminal enterprises operating at higher levels of the organization. As members advance through the ranks, they encounter increasingly serious activities. What begins as harmless ritual work gradually escalates to include financial fraud, identity theft, blackmail, and in the most extreme cases, activities that directly harm vulnerable individuals. The progression is so gradual that many participants don't recognize the transformation until they're deeply compromised. These networks have developed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that go far beyond anything seen in historical occult groups. They employ professional-grade social engineering, leveraging personal information gathered through extensive surveillance of members' digital activities. This information is used to create powerful leverage that ensures loyalty and silence. The financial operations of these groups represent another level of sophistication entirely. They operate legitimate businesses that serve as fronts for money laundering, maintain complex networks of shell companies, and utilize cryptocurrency markets to move funds across international borders. Some have even established charitable organizations that provide them with tax benefits while creating additional opportunities for recruitment and influence. Perhaps most concerning is their infiltration of legitimate institutions. Members are encouraged to pursue careers in education, healthcare, social services, and law enforcement. This isn't random career advice, but a strategic placement designed to provide the organization with inside information, early warning of investigations, and opportunities to identify and recruit vulnerable individuals who come into contact with these systems. The technological capabilities of these groups continue to evolve rapidly. They employ artificial intelligence for analyzing potential recruits' social media profiles, use deepfake technology for creating compromising materials, and maintain sophisticated surveillance networks that monitor both members and targets. Some groups have even developed their own encrypted communication platforms that they market to other criminal organizations. International coordination presents another significant challenge for law enforcement. These networks operate across multiple jurisdictions, exploiting differences in legal systems and enforcement capabilities. They maintain safe houses and operational bases in countries with weak rule of law, while conducting their most sensitive activities in regions where they've cultivated relationships with corrupt officials. The ritualistic elements of these groups serve multiple functions beyond their spiritual significance. Complex ceremonies create powerful psychological bonds between members, establish clear hierarchies, and provide opportunities for filming compromising activities that can later be used for blackmail. The occult symbolism also serves as a sophisticated communication system that allows members to identify each other and coordinate activities without detection by conventional surveillance methods. Educational institutions have become particular targets for infiltration and recruitment. These groups recognize that universities and colleges provide access to young, idealistic individuals who are questioning traditional authority structures and exploring alternative belief systems. They often establish seemingly legitimate student organizations or infiltrate existing groups focused on philosophy, history, or comparative religion. The psychological damage inflicted on members who eventually leave these organizations is profound and long-lasting. The combination of ritual trauma, financial exploitation, and social isolation creates complex psychological dependencies that make escape extremely difficult. Many former members report years of therapy being necessary to fully understand and recover from their experiences. Law enforcement agencies worldwide are struggling to adapt their investigative techniques to address these evolving threats. Traditional approaches designed for hierarchical criminal organizations prove inadequate when dealing with networks that operate through distributed, encrypted communications and maintain strict compartmentalization of information. The convergence of ancient occult practices with modern technology has created something unprecedented in human history. Criminal organizations that can operate with near impunity while maintaining the psychological control mechanisms that have made occult groups effective for centuries. These networks represent a fundamental challenge to traditional concepts of law enforcement, national security, and individual freedom. As we conclude our examination of these 33 chilling practices, we must acknowledge that the landscape of occult activity continues to evolve at an unprecedented pace. The combination of technological sophistication, international coordination, and psychological manipulation techniques has created organizations that pose threats extending far beyond individual victims to the stability of entire communities and institutions. The most disturbing aspect of this evolution is how these groups have learned to exploit the very freedoms and technologies that define modern democratic societies. They use our communication networks, financial systems, and legal protections to build organizations that ultimately seek to undermine the foundations of the society that enables their existence. Understanding these threats requires a fundamental shift in how we approach occult-related criminal activity. We can no longer treat these as isolated incidents involving troubled individuals, but must recognize them as sophisticated criminal enterprises that require coordinated international responses and innovative investigative techniques. The battle between legitimate spiritual exploration and predatory criminal organizations operating under occult pretenses will likely define much of the security landscape in the coming decades. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into these 33 chilling satanic rituals, we must confront the most disturbing reality of all. The networks we've exposed don't simply vanish when the lights come on or when law enforcement closes in. They adapt, they evolve, and they metastasize into new forms that are often more dangerous than their predecessors. The contemporary landscape of ritual abuse and occult-influenced criminal activity has transformed dramatically in the digital age. What once required physical gatherings in remote locations now operates through encrypted networks spanning continents. The traditional boundaries between legitimate spiritual practice and criminal conspiracy have become increasingly blurred, creating perfect cover for those who would exploit the vulnerable. Consider the emergence of what investigators now term hybrid networks. These organizations maintain the appearance of legitimate religious or therapeutic communities while operating sophisticated criminal enterprises beneath the surface. They've learned from the mistakes of previous generations, understanding that the dramatic ritual sacrifices and obvious satanic symbolism that characterized earlier cases only serve to attract unwanted attention. Modern practitioners have embraced a more subtle approach. They understand that true power lies not in theatrical displays, but in systematic psychological manipulation. They've studied the techniques of legitimate therapy, spiritual counseling, and community building, then perverted these methods for their own purposes. The result is organizations that can operate for decades without detection, slowly corrupting individuals and families while maintaining the facade of respectability. The international scope of these networks cannot be overstated. Digital communication has allowed previously isolated groups to connect and share resources in ways that would have been impossible just 20 years ago. Encrypted messaging platforms, anonymous file sharing, and sophisticated money laundering schemes have created an underground economy that thrives on human suffering. Law enforcement agencies worldwide have documented the emergence of what they call ritual trafficking networks. These organizations combine elements of traditional human trafficking with occult symbolism and psychological programming techniques. Victims are not simply exploited for labor or sexual purposes, but are subjected to elaborate conditioning processes designed to break down their sense of reality and personal identity. The programming techniques employed by these networks represent a disturbing evolution of earlier mind control experiments. Drawing from decades of research into psychological manipulation, modern practitioners have developed methods that can fundamentally alter a person's perception of reality without leaving obvious physical evidence. Victims may function normally in society while carrying out instructions they don't consciously remember receiving. Perhaps most troubling is the infiltration of legitimate institutions. These networks have learned that the most effective way to avoid detection is to embed themselves within organizations that society trusts. Educational institutions, healthcare systems, religious organizations, and even law enforcement agencies have all been compromised to varying degrees. This infiltration serves multiple purposes. It provides cover for criminal activities, access to potential victims, and early warning of any investigations. The financial mechanisms supporting these networks have become increasingly sophisticated. Traditional funding sources like drug trafficking and extortion have been supplemented by complex investment schemes, cryptocurrency operations, and legitimate business ventures. Some of the world's most successful companies unknowingly serve as fronts or funding sources for these criminal enterprises. The recruitment and indoctrination processes have evolved to exploit modern society's vulnerabilities. Social media platforms provide unprecedented access to potential victims, while dating apps and professional networking sites offer cover for initial contact. The lonely, the desperate, and the ambitious all represent potential targets for recruitment into these networks. The psychological profiles of modern practitioners reveal a disturbing trend toward intellectual sophistication. Unlike the unstable individuals who characterized earlier satanic crime cases, contemporary network leaders often possess advanced degrees, professional credentials, and extensive knowledge of psychology, technology, and finance. They approach their criminal activities with the same methodical precision that legitimate professionals apply to their work. The ritual aspects of these networks have not disappeared, but have been refined and systematized. Rather than crude ceremonies in abandoned buildings, modern practitioners conduct elaborate psychological operations designed to achieve specific behavioral outcomes. These rituals may occur over months or years, gradually reshaping victims' personalities and loyalties without their conscious awareness. The global nature of these networks has created unprecedented challenges for law enforcement. Jurisdictional boundaries that once provided natural barriers to criminal activity have become meaningless in the digital age. A network operating primarily in Eastern Europe may recruit victims in North America, conduct training in Southeast Asia, and launder money through banks in the Caribbean. The corruption of legitimate spiritual practices represents one of the most insidious aspects of these networks. They deliberately target individuals seeking authentic spiritual experiences, then gradually introduce increasingly disturbing elements into what initially appears to be legitimate religious practice. By the time victims recognize the true nature of their situation, they have often been compromised beyond their ability to seek help. The intergenerational nature of many of these networks ensures their continued survival despite law enforcement efforts. Children born into these organizations are subjected to conditioning from birth, creating individuals who genuinely believe in the righteousness of their cause. These second- and third-generation members often possess no frame of reference for normal human relationships or ethical behavior. The technological sophistication of modern networks extends beyond simple communication and financial tools. They employ advanced surveillance equipment, biometric identification systems, and even artificial intelligence to monitor and control their members. The panopticon that once existed only in theoretical discussions has become a practical reality for those trapped within these organizations. The symbiotic relationship between these networks and legitimate criminal organizations has created a shadow economy that parallels the legitimate financial system. Drug cartels, arms dealers, and human trafficking organizations all maintain connections to ritual-based networks, creating a web of criminal activity that is nearly impossible to fully dismantle. The psychological warfare capabilities of these networks represent perhaps their most dangerous evolution. They have developed techniques for manipulating public opinion, discrediting investigators, and creating false narratives that protect their operations. The same social media platforms that connect families and communities have become weapons for psychological manipulation on a mass scale. The medical and scientific communities have been particular targets for infiltration and corruption. By placing their members in positions of authority within healthcare systems and research institutions, these networks can suppress investigations, manipulate research findings, and gain access to vulnerable patient populations. The trust that society places in medical professionals becomes a weapon against those who would expose their activities. The legal system itself has not been immune to corruption. Prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys have all been compromised to varying degrees, creating a situation where even successful investigations may not result in meaningful prosecutions. The complexity of these cases, combined with the reluctance of victims to testify, creates additional barriers to justice. As we conclude this examination of 33 chilling satanic rituals, we must acknowledge that our exploration has only scratched the surface of a phenomenon that continues to evolve and adapt. The networks we've exposed represent a clear and present danger to the stability of civilized society, yet they operate with an impunity that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of law enforcement. The true horror of these rituals lies not in their theatrical elements, but in their systematic destruction of human dignity and autonomy. They represent the ultimate expression of human evil, the deliberate corruption of everything that makes us human. The victims of these networks are not simply casualties of criminal activity, but are deliberately transformed into weapons against their own communities and families. The responsibility for confronting this threat cannot rest solely with law enforcement or government agencies. Every member of society must remain vigilant for the signs of these networks' influence. The price of freedom has always been eternal vigilance, and never has this truth been more relevant than in our current era. The rituals we've examined serve as a stark reminder that the capacity for evil within human nature has not diminished with technological progress or social evolution. If anything, these advances have provided new tools for those who would exploit and corrupt others. The challenge facing civilization is not simply to develop better detection and prosecution methods, but to strengthen the moral and spiritual foundations that serve as society's ultimate defense against such predation. The battle against these networks is ultimately a battle for the soul of humanity itself. It requires not just courage and determination, but wisdom and discernment. We must learn to distinguish between legitimate expressions of human spirituality and the corrupted perversions that masquerade as authentic religious experience. The 33 rituals we've exposed represent more than historical curiosities or contemporary criminal activities. They serve as warnings about the depths to which human beings can sink when they abandon their moral foundations and embrace the darkness that lurks within the human heart. The eternal struggle between good and evil continues to play out in new arenas with new weapons. But the fundamental nature of that conflict remains unchanged. Our examination concludes with this sobering recognition. The networks that perpetrate these rituals will continue to evolve and adapt as long as there are vulnerable individuals to exploit and corrupt. The only defense against their influence is a society committed to truth, justice, and the fundamental dignity of every human being. The choice between light and darkness remains before us, as it has for every generation that has walked this earth.